Well, seeing 3:15, I call us back into our session. We have our final presentation from Mr. Jamie Gass. Let me take just a moment to read a short bio on him. Jamie Gass is Pioneer Institute's Director of the Center for School Reform. At Pioneer, he has framed, commissioned, and managed over 60 research papers and numerous policy events on K through 12th education reform topics. Jamie has more than 2 decades of experience in public administration and education reform at the state, municipal, and school district levels. Previously, he worked at the Massachusetts Office of Educational Quality and Accountability, a senior policy analyst, technical writer, and in the state budget office under 2 Massachusetts governors. In the 1990s, Jamie worked for the dean, the Boston University School of Education, Boston University management team, in its historic partnership with the Chelsea Public Schools. He has appeared on numerous media outlets and has been quoted in numerous publications. So, Mr. Gass, you are recognized. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members and Senator. I want to really tell you how grateful I am for the opportunity to come and provide testimony to you about the Common Core. I also want to take the opportunity to thank and show our appreciation for the Speaker of the House here in Oklahoma for his strong words and skepticism about Common Core. But mostly I want to thank Jenny and Lynn and the other Oklahoma moms who invited me down here to help provide some insights into our experiences in Massachusetts and the work that we've done on Common Core. So I work for a place called Pioneer Institute. It's a Boston-based think tank that's been around for about 20 years. We are one of the prime movers behind a lot of the successful education reforms of the last 20 years in Massachusetts. We're probably best known for the work we've done on school choice, charter schools, and the like, but we've had a keen interest in academic standards for some time. We're known for our independence and the thorough data-driven elements in our research. And in fact, many of the authors that you heard just previous were folks that we lined up and commissioned to do this work on Common Core. We're very proud of the fact that we are independent. We take no government money. We have not taken any foundation money for our work on Common Core whatsoever. So we believe that it helps provide an independent straight talk on what Common Core is all about. So just to give you a little bit of context, I want to just sort of define what Common Core is up front. So Common Core state standards are a product of the Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers. That's the commissioners of education from each state. They've gotten generous funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I think about $170 million by our calculation, not only for the development of the standards, but in most instances, the evaluation of those standards. So it can truly be said that Common Core, when it comes to the Gates Foundation, they're both, the Gates Foundation is both judge and jury in their own case in a lot of instances. And in fact, the only other cost analysis that has been done on Common Core aside from ours, was also conducted by an institution from Washington, D.C. that also accepted Gates Foundation money. So I want to give you just a little bit of historical context before I talk about Common Core. I think the Founding Fathers were very wise. They understood that there is a proper balance between state and local considerations in our form of government. And under our national government, the federal government is responsible for defense and trade and foreign policy, but K-12 education historically has been the proper purview of state and local governments. And in fact, even at this late date, 90% of the funding for K-12 education in this country comes from state and local governments. While the U.S. Constitution is virtually silent on K-12 education, the state constitutions are quite specific. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. So in my home state of Massachusetts, the Constitution was drafted by John Adams in 1779. There's several paragraphs. They're called the Cherish Clause, and it goes into a lot of detail about how state and local officials are responsible for cherishing literature, mathematics, science, and the like, and that it's their responsibility to perpetuate this for their posterity. Also, too, in Virginia, with some input from Thomas Jefferson, but primarily through James Madison and George Mason, the Virginia Constitution, too, is very specific and clear about the proper role and duties of state and local officials in perpetuating K-12 education. And We all know from our history lessons that both the Continental Congress and the Constitutional Conventions were comprised of delegates from states. States and the representation of states is an elemental part of what we call competitive federalism, which is this balance between state, local, and national authority. And I'd submit that that system has actually served this country quite well. It's taken us from essentially a collection of colonies along the eastern seaboard to now the most powerful country in the world. And it done so in a pretty short period of time. But again, as the founding fathers were very wise, they understood that keeping that education at the state and local level, and particularly closely and intimately connected with parents and teachers, the people that are the most responsible for raising children and educating children, is really the way to go. But again, that system, I think, in everyone across the political spectrum will acknowledge, has begun to fray in recent decades. And in fact, in 1983, President Ronald Reagan commissioned a report called A Nation at Risk. And what it found was that the current status of public education in the United States had fallen quite dramatically from its probably high point in the 40s and 50s. Specifically, they are very concerned about the ability of the United States to compete internationally with countries like Hong Kong and Singapore and South Korea and China and the like. But what that report from President Reagan's commission did not do was come up with a top-down solution for Washington, D.C. In fact, there's a real skepticism in and around Nation at Risk of these education trade groups that we now find pushing Common Core. So there's been different remedies that states have pursued to try to improve public education. One of the approaches was developed by Milton Friedman, the economist, in the 1980s, called for greater school choice, parental choice through charter schools and vouchers, homeschooling, and other choice models. But there was always, in the 1980s, a group that coalesced around these education trade groups in Washington, D.C., who always believed that the way in which we could reform public education was through a top-down approach driven in Washington, D.C. And I'll speak specifically about some of the interests in and around the first Bush administration and then in the early 1990s and the first Clinton administration that are the Governors Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers, the American Federation for Teachers, Republicans and Democrats, but largely DC-based interests that really believe that if we all just had a set of national standards, testing, and curricula, that we could solve the educational problems. There's a third model that was really pursued in my state of Massachusetts. I'm just going to tell you briefly about it because it has a great deal of bearing on how we view Common Core and how we got involved with Common Core. So in the early 1990s, Republican Governor Bill Weld, in conjunction with two Democratic state legislators, Tom Birmingham and Mark Roosevelt, sat down and crafted what they call the Grand Bargain. And what the Grand Bargain is that the state agreed to put in additional state and commit localities for a base funding in exchange for all the difficult things that people in K-12 education had not wanted to do over the previous decades, which had been a deep commitment to English, math, science, and history, a kind of back-to-basics approach. You heard a little bit from the testimony of both Zev Werman and Sandra Sotsky. Sandra Sotsky is the one who developed those standards in Massachusetts. And I'll just tell you just briefly what was in those standards. There was a deep commitment to classic literature, poetry, and drama, specifically texts like Huckleberry Finn and Edith Wharton and Charles Dickens and Sherlock Holmes. These texts matter specifically because the higher quality vocabulary found in those pieces of classic literature, poetry, and drama is higher quality than what you're going to find in what they call nonfiction or informational texts. Other part of the education reform in Massachusetts was having a high-stakes graduation test so that there was a kind of addressed social promotion. Dr. Stotsky then aligned the standards for the students, the testing for the students, along with the testing for the teachers. So all of the people in the system, particularly the students and the teachers, were being tested on the same material. We also injected in there some charter schools, which gave an element of school choice. So what happened in Massachusetts really has been historic, and I'm not saying this by way of bragging about my state, but I'm just trying to contrast it with the relative stagnation that the rest of the country is experienced, is that So in 2005, 2007, 2009, and 2011, Massachusetts, in every category, tested on what they call the nation's report card, the NAEP test that you referred to earlier in testimony. Massachusetts scored #1 in every grade tested and every subject tested. No state had ever done it once, and Massachusetts has done it 4 times in a row. Then, addressing this issue of international competitiveness, Massachusetts tested as an individual country in 2007 and 2011 against Hong Kong and Singapore and South Korea and Japan. And our 8th graders in 2007 were tied for #1 in the world in science. So these successes have really been remarkable. And again, I don't brag about it. I'm just saying that the evidence from Massachusetts is that if state-level boards of education, state-level leaderships and governors over a period of time can commit to high-quality academic-based standards with high-stakes testing, some choice, and accountability throughout the entire system, the evidence is that we don't have to look to Hong Kong or Singapore or Finland or all the countries that people tend to look to for international comparisons. We have a native-grown example right here in Massachusetts. So there's some school choice features, there's some charter schools, vocational technical schools, and even the Archdiocese schools in Boston also kind of aligned with this very strong commitment to rigorous academic standards in English, math, and science and history. That's the good news. The bad news is that in 2007 and 2008, the Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers began to develop Common Core. Again, these folks that had been in Washington, D.C. for decades and firmly believed that the way to solve the problems in public education was not to look at Massachusetts, but to come up with a top-down solution, develop the Common Core. And then in 2009, the Obama administration initiated through the stimulus funding the Race to the Top, which is a $4.3 billion grant program that made states compete for their own tax dollars by way of signing on to agenda items that they believed were the best interests of education reform. In that Race to the Top application process, and in most instances, state legislatures really had little or no knowledge of what was going on in the Race to the Top. They were really committed to by the governor's office and the state boards of education. But the 2 features that were really states had to commit to in order to compete for Race to the Top was Common Core standards, or what they call college and career readiness standards, and nationalized testing. And I'll talk a little bit why that has been such a problem. So given the success that Massachusetts had in the previous several decades in education reform, and given Pioneer's role in driving some of that, Massachusetts really had the most to lose. That was always the state that the advocates of Common Core needed to put on their mantelpiece in order to get other states to fall in line. So we conducted 4 independent crosswalks that evaluated both the English and math standards found in Common Core against high standard states like Massachusetts and Georgia and Indiana and California and Texas and others. And those pieces of research were conducted. They're very exhaustive and detailed pieces of research. Dr. Stotsky did the English language arts side. Zev Werman did the math side, and then we enlisted a 3rd mathematician, James Milgram, who was a professor of mathematics at Stanford University. Both Dr. Stotsky and Dr. Milgram had served on the validation committee for the Common Core and had refused to sign off on it. But what they did in these independent evaluations is they looked at Massachusetts and other high standard states against Common Core. And what they found is that at every step of the way, Common Core was of significantly lower quality in terms of both English and math than high standard states. They also went on to further point out, and you heard in testimony earlier, that in fact Common Core was not benchmarked against the highest performing countries in the world in math and science. Specifically, what Common Core had done is it had ignored the evidence from Massachusetts and other high standard states like Indiana and Georgia, and dramatically cut classic literature, poetry, and drama by about 60%. So even though the evidence was clear from the Massachusetts success and elsewhere that this was the way to go, they ignored that evidence and went in a different direction. The other thing that Common Core did on the mathematics side was that they also ignored the evidence from Massachusetts and California and high-performing countries, and rather than having students prepared for mathematics, Algebra 1 by 8th grade, they pushed back preparation for Algebra 1 a grade or more. In addition to that, Common Core embraced an experimental form of geometry that has never been successful in any place that's been tried in the world. So that's on the sort of the academic quality side of Common Core. But people in and around the K-12 education world for decades have known that there are actually federal laws that explicitly prohibits the federal government and the U.S. Department of Education from advancing, directing, validating, or funding national standards, testing, and curricula. So we enlisted a guy named Kent Talbert and Bob Eitel. They were the general counsel and deputy general counsel at the U.S. Department of Education under the second Bush administration, two highest-ranking lawyers in the federal government. What they looked at was all of the laws in and around national standards and testing, and what they found is that there actually are 3 federal laws that explicitly prohibits it. It's the Elementary Secondary Education Act of 1965, signed by Lyndon Johnson. There is the General Education Provisions Act of 1970, signed by Richard Nixon. And then there was the U.S. Education Department enabling legislation in 1979, signed by President Carter. All of these laws, and they're laws, they're not just a list of recommendations, they're federal laws that were signed by U.S. presidents, explicitly and in unequivocal language makes it clear that this is not something the U.S. Department of Education is permitted to do. Nonetheless, the U.S. Department of Education, through both the Race to the Top and directly funding the 2 national testing consortia, the Smarter Balanced Testing Consortia and the PARC Testing Consortia, which is one that Oklahoma used to participate in, this is a violation of federal law. Some of the critics of our views on these things have said that these are the opinions of people on the fringe or the extremists, but right after we released our paper on the legal dimensions of Common Core, George Will, the syndicated columnist, wrote a column for the Washington Post that had ended up getting a circulation in hundreds of other papers across the country and reached about 30 million readers, saying exactly what it is that we had cited in the research about the illegality in and around Common Core. So we did a companion piece to that builds on the loss of state and local autonomy that we just released about a month or so ago. That was written by former Texas Commissioner Robert Scott. Texas is one of the few states from the beginning that said no to Common Core, said no to Race to the Top, and said no to any national testing. That piece of research was done in conjunction with Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley. But again, one of the major problems in and around Common Core is that while the federal government and some of the player education trade groups around Washington, D.C. are the ones that are foisting this on the states, in fact, the state and local governments are going to pay for 90% of it. And so we thought that someone in and around this discussion should actually do a cost projection, because most state legislatures across the country, I'd say 90 or 95% of the state legislatures were not really informed of Common Core. They had no hearings. There were no bills in most cases across the country. And most boards of education across the country, again, I'd say 90% or higher, conducted no cost projection or cost-benefit analysis of what it would take to adopt and align Common Core with Common Core. So we enlisted a guy named Ted Rebarber. He was a staffer at the U.S. Department of Education under the first Bush administration and the first Clinton administration. So he'd worked for both Republicans and Democrats. He was the kind of staffer that had been in the room when former President Clinton and former Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole and former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich were hashing out the small percentages of federal funding that go to K-12 education. And what Mr. Rebarber and his folks at Accountability Works came up with in terms of a cost projection, and I think it's actually a mid-ranged cost projection. We were certainly not trying to run up the numbers to make a point, is that they came up with a figure of $16 billion that is what it'll cost for the states and localities to implement Common Core. In a state like Massachusetts, which is a relatively small state and has already spent $100 billion with a B, to implement the successful reforms over the last 20 years, it'll cost us about $360 million for standards that are qualitatively lower than the ones that we already had. You folks in Oklahoma are somewhat lucky because it's only going to cost you $220 million. So that sort of gets us to where we are now. The fact is that we are now working in about 20 states there's a variety of different states that have either pulled out of the National Testing Consortium, including Oklahoma and Alabama, just yesterday, Florida, Utah. There's states like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Indiana that have put a pause on Common Core. But the reality of it is that the more state legislators and parents and moms in particular, I would say that a vast majority of the audiences we've spoken to, and we've spoken to groups of 5 people, and we've spoken in front of 900 people, is that 70% of the audiences are moms and grandmothers. This is very much the pushback on it is very much what I would characterize as a mom-driven movement. So with that, thank you so much for the opportunity to provide testimony, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right, who's first up? Representative Kern, we'll begin with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gass, you mentioned, am I not on? Come on. You mentioned Race to the Top was $4.3 million. That was from the stimulus. And was that ever vetted in Congress?
So it was $4.3 billion, and there were no bills that were submitted to Congress specifically authorizing or even really discussing in detail the Common Core or the national testing or funding of national testing at all. It was all, I think, what budgeteers described as discretionary funding under the U.S. Department of Education. So there were never any congressional hearings or any bills filed specifically on national standards or testing.
Okay, thank you. Follow up. Has Congress since done something, coming back saying the Department of Ed should not be doing this?
Senator Cruz from Texas, Senator Rubio from Florida, Senator Grassley, a variety of different congressmen have begun over the last, I'd say, 6 to 8 months, making more and more, leveling more concerns against what's going on here. I mean, in addition to the Race to the Top, the U.S. Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, has been authorizing waivers from the No Child Left Behind law. Previous U.S. Secretaries of Education were allowed to provide waivers from No Child Left Behind. That happened when Secretary Spellings was at the U.S. Department of Education. The difference between what she did and what Secretary Duncan has done is that they added additional conditions onto those waivers that were not authorized by Congress. So the waivers, in a very real sense, or at least the conditional waivers that Secretary Duncan has been authorizing, are not authorized by Congress. So he's acting unilaterally.
Mm-hmm. May I have another one?
Sure.
I have several. FERPA, the FERPA laws.
Yeah.
We heard Dr. Stotsky say that the student data system was not originally a part of Common Core, but now it seems to be. Can you address how the proponents of Common Core are going around FERPA, what they've done to FERPA, and how this data system has now become a part of it?
So part of the Race to Top application, states had to commit to, I think they call it longitudinal data systems, or it's a collection of student data over time. And again, there are these federal laws that explicitly prohibit the federal government from doing it. So what they've been trying to do is, through Race to the Top, is incentivize states to do it. I mean, there's a pattern here. You see where there are limits on what the federal government can do. The Governors Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers developed the standards. The federal government has paid for these private testing consortia that operate outside of the U.S. Department of Education to develop the test, but they're paid for by the U.S. Department of Education. And the same thing is with the FERPA. The feds are prohibited from doing this, so they got this, try to get the states to do it. We're in the process of conducting more research on it. The two people that I would point you to in terms of experts, and these are the folks that are working on research for us, are Jane Robbins from the American Principles Project and Joy Pullman from the Heartland Institute. For my money, those are the two best experts on what's going on in the data collection side. I would describe the data collection as running parallel to Common Core. There's nothing in the Common Core standards themselves, and there's nothing in the testing, the PARC or the SBAC testing consortia that specifically talks about data collection, but it runs parallel to it. And the U.S. Department of Education, I believe, very much envisions a world. In fact, the U.S. Secretary of Education, Duncan, has talked about a world in which you can track children from really cradle to career, is what they call it. It's, pre-K through 20 or 21 or something like that. So what they're trying to do is gather both academic data and, from my point of view, a lot of personal and sort of non-academic data to create a kind of large profile for each individual child. But again, it's not entirely clear what that's going to look like at this point.
Before I come to Representative Nolan, let me ask a question, and it would be in two parts. One, I listened to a speech by Mr. Gates today. Now, I don't know when he gave the speech, but it was recently. And he kept talking about products, producing these products. And then he talked about customers. And I would assume customers would be either schools or students. I don't really get the connection. So my first question is, if this is supposed to be so state-driven, then why is the Gates Foundation playing such a pivotal role and appear to be driving the thing? The second question, and you may have said this, so I apologize if I missed it, why is Common Core going to cost almost 4 times as much as Race to the Top? I mean, if I get your numbers right, one was $4.3 billion, this one's $16 billion.
Right.
Okay.
No, that's exactly right. So I think that in the beginning of my remarks, I talked about sort of there's been some decline that's going on in public education. From my point of view, one of the biggest problems, and it's one that Massachusetts remedied in our efforts, is that a lot of people in and around public education, particularly the Governors Association, Achieve Inc., who is driving the Park Consortia, the Council of Chief State School Officers, Gates Foundation, and others, they really believe that K-12 education is not what the founders envisioned, which is a system of education in English and mathematics and science in order to educate citizenship for participation in our republic. They really believe that the sole function of public education is workforce development, which really, I have to say, is more of a European model of education. And in fact, it's not even really education, it's more training. So I think that they just firmly believe that this is the way in which we need to compete in the 21st century. I think if you look at the history of the country, you see that until recent decades, when we've been trying to move to this more skills-based workforce development model, that the American system of education has actually worked quite well, both primarily for educating citizenship for participation in our country, but those deep grounding in real knowledge makes them better voters, and in fact makes them better legislators and makes them better workers too. So it has a kind of dual effect. They're much less concerned with history and civics. They're much less concerned with academic subjects as they are for this kind of workforce development. I just say one thing about that. In Massachusetts, even our vocational technical schools, and we've got a very good vocational technical program in Massachusetts, those vocational technical schools were among the lowest performing schools in the state for a long time. They embraced these academic standards, blended them with occupational education, and they saw about a 40% improvement in their test scores, which it tells you that if you're going to be a auto mechanic or you're going to be an electrician or a carpenter, you need to actually know a lot of math, and you need to know how to analyze things, and these are just good these are good pieces of knowledge that benefit everyone. The second part of your question is that I think, generally speaking, when the federal government gets involved with things, they don't tend to do things on the cheap side, especially when other people are going to be paying for it. And so while the advocates of Common Core are from Washington, D.C., again, we're going to be paying, people at the state and local level are going to be paying for 90% of it. So they're making prescriptions that we're going to end up having to fill at the state and local level.
Well, it sounds to me like this whole program is almost more driven to create worker bees, which seems to be far less kind of liberty-based, what we've always been, and almost more like a communist-based system where you just pick out, what students are going to be. You want workers. Am I getting that correct? I mean, is that kind of, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth.
Yeah, I would definitely say that it has a more European, I would sort of say national, workforce development model. There's no question, and I think it definitely lends itself to a kind of more managed economy. Look, I work for 3 free market think tanks. The advocates of Common Core have talked about creating a market. You don't create a market. Markets create themselves organically.
That's exactly
right. And so what they're really doing is creating a monopoly. Let's be honest about it. When there's one national standard and all the tests, national tests are going to be aligned with it, and all the schools, whether they're private or parochial or public schools or vocational technical schools, are all going to be meeting the same standard, school choice isn't going to mean a lot under the Common Core worldview. But again, these are not people that generally have been big advocates of school choice anyway.
Yeah, okay. Representative Nolan and then Representative Kern will come back because I know you have some other follow-ups, but Representative Nolan.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Here in Oklahoma, we've had a bit of a disconnect between Common Ed and higher ed in the sense that Common Ed has been very focused on preparing for Common Core, getting our EOI tests, our end-of-the-year instruction tests, and exit exams in line. And higher ed is looking at ACT scores. They're not looking at EOIs at all. And so I'm just curious, as you mentioned that Massachusetts and some of the other states that have really had a lot of success. Do they align higher ed and Common Ed? I love the idea about the professors that are in higher ed actually developing some of the curriculum for the STEM subjects in particular, but just period. I love that idea because it seems like it aligns it, but is that what they're doing in other states, or are we?
Yeah, so just to be clear, I mean, Massachusetts discarded our higher quality standards. We got $250 million from Race to the Top, and in fact, the only thing that changed from round 1 of Race to the Top, where we were 13th out of 16 states that applied, and we were number 1 in the second round. The only thing that changed was the agreement to adopt Common Core. So as I said earlier, it was always a case where Massachusetts was either going to not adopt or not get the money. And it just, again, it highlights the sort of the federal dimension of it. Our higher education system has gotten, I would say, a lot less focus of the efforts thus far. But I think there's no question that the current administration in Massachusetts, as well as the U.S. Department of Education, they envision a kind of seamless cradle-to-career model where, whether it's through the academic expectations in Common Core you find in K-12, I think ultimately will have a big impact on higher ed. I mean, for example, if they cut classic literature and poetry and drama by 60%, I think, common sense tells you there's not going to be as many English majors going, and that will have a big impact. And people like Zev Werman and Professor Milgram have gone into even greater detail. In fact, we have a report we're going to release just next week, and you folks have an advanced copy of it, of how this is going to dramatically impact higher education, not just in Massachusetts, but across the country. The other ways in which it's going to impact higher education is that the architect of Common Core is a guy named David Coleman. He is now just in the last 6 or 8 months been appointed the head of the College Board, and he has talked about changing the vision of the SAT, for example, to align with Common Core, which in our view will significantly dumb down the SAT and change that from what they call an aptitude test. It's a projection of how kids are likely to do in higher ed to an achievement test, which is what the ACT is. So it's a hard question. It's an important and very good question, but it's a little bit of a black box because most of what they're trying to do with Common Core is implemented now at the state level. They're having a lot of resistance across the country on that alone, but I think given their inclinations on this, that it's really only a matter of time until they try to push something similar to it on higher ed. And that's why I think that the advice you got from Dr. Stotsky was a good one, was to try to develop a local matriculation test so that you're determining what it is college readiness in your state. And I could see states like Oklahoma and Texas having the independence to go that path. I'm not sure that's what will happen in Massachusetts, unfortunately. And in terms of the standards themselves, that's really how Sandy developed the high-quality standards of Massachusetts. She enlisted all of the advice from academic experts in English and math and science from our own institutions, but also across the country.
May I follow
We'll
up?
go to Senator, do you have follow-up? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, have you experienced, or have you, experienced or seen any of our, in other states, any of the higher ed institutions beginning to accept the exit exams from the high school as entrance exams into higher ed?
Well, what we did in Massachusetts under the previous high-stakes testing is that the state scholarship, so basically the better kids did on our MCAS test, our state test, which is a high-stakes graduation test, that then made them eligible for higher education scholarships in higher education. But I have to say that I think most people in higher education across the country don't have a clue what's going on with Common Core. The world of K-12 education is pretty siloed from higher ed, and I think most of them don't have the slightest idea what's going on, and I think that it'll be, the train will be, leaving the station before they understand.
Senator Sharp, and then we'll come back to.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gass, first of all, appreciate that you take the time to come here to Oklahoma and discuss this issue with us. And 2 years ago, I was in the classroom. I spent 38 years as a public school teacher, and of course, when we got these Common Core standards, obviously, I found very tremendous problems with them. And one of the, as an old common education teacher, one of the major things that I found it looks like the problem is with Common Core that you're trying to create a student that has all the answers but none of the facts.
Right.
And that is, to me, the major problem with Common Core.
Yeah.
And I think that as long as we go in this direction, we're going to have problems. And there are absolutes. I don't care what teacher out there, you have to teach in absolutes. 2 + 2 = 4. And unfortunately, with Common Core, 2 + 2 may = 5 if you get the process right.
Yep.
And history, trying to discuss whether or not how George Washington would have handled the Civil War differently than what Abraham Lincoln will take kids' imagination for a few minutes, and then they'll say this is ridiculous. Because, again, you do have to have absolute somewhere. How would you like to respond to that?
I think that's well said, Senator. I think that from my perspective as having done a lot of and commissioned a lot of the research, I think in and around Common Core, there were hard-won fights in both English and math that occurred in Massachusetts and California and other places in the 90s. They called them the math wars over these fuzzy math or were more kind of fact-driven approach. Common Core was, and Jim Milgram, the Stanford mathematician, was very clear about this because it's a political document that was developed really through, well, we're not exactly sure what the process was, but they were making compromises and actually gave back things that were hard-won in other states 10 or 15 years earlier. And so I think you're absolutely spot on. There's no question with Common Core. While they have some window dressing of academic content that I think all of us would agree is good quality, I think it's mostly what they're trying to do, again, is to the chairman's point, is a kind of workforce development model where you're really kind of getting inculcated in this Common Core method. And you're right. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about kids getting the right answer, but that being the wrong answer because they didn't they didn't describe how they got their answer and things like that. I mean, that's sort of textbook fuzzy math. I mean, I'll just speak from experience. I've got a 2-year-old daughter and a 6-year-old daughter in Massachusetts, and my 6-year-old was in kindergarten last year, and rather than beginning to work on the, basic, numbers and addition and subtraction and things like that, they had her baking gingerbread men and counting, gumdrop buttons and things like that doing what they call hands-on learning or experiential learning was a substitute for actually learning math facts, which I think is pretty wrong-headed.
Representative Kern, back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I heard it said like this last couple of weeks in this meeting that I attended was they're not asking the students to read the Constitution at all, but yet one of the exercises is to debate the Constitution, and someone said they're asking students to have opinions on things of which they know nothing about. And that's a lot of Common Core. A question is, in Massachusetts, they, did so well with the standards that they have. Were homeschoolers included in that or not? Do you know?
So it's an excellent question. The way homeschoolers are authorized in Massachusetts is that the parents or need to go before the local school board, not the State Board of Education, but the local school committee, and get authorization. I think that, again, the performance in Massachusetts was so good, and that even the archdiocese schools, and I talked about as well as Massachusetts did, the archdiocese schools, the Catholic schools in Massachusetts adopted the Massachusetts standards, because they thought it was better aligned with a Catholic education or Christian education than what they were doing before. I mean, it's that kind of deep commitment to humanities and poetry and literature and drama that kind of help us and our children understand what it means to be human. But I think that some of the homeschool folks at least copied some of it. They probably exceeded it, to be honest with you. That one of the issues that we have is that homeschoolers then will, under Common Core, will have to go to their local school committee and get authorization. And again, if the SAT and the ACT and these other college, entrance exams are tied to Common Core, it's going to, I think, create a lot of problems for homeschoolers.
Okay. Another question I have, it's already been mentioned that it looks like Common Core is focusing more upon skills rather than academic knowledge.
Yep.
So has your institute done anything to look at the involvement of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Common
Yeah, I
Core?
mean, that has been, one of the troubling dimensions of this, and we've not done a lot of research on it, but we've informally, developed spreadsheets that total it up. I mean, the Gates Foundation has spent about $170 million, and they've given grants to state boards of education and the associations around state boards of education, the PTA, the PTA, obviously the Governors Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers. They've funded Education Week, which is a newspaper, a trade newspaper that, and they've basically funded them to cover it. ExxonMobil has run ads that I think many of us have seen. They've funded the Chamber of Commerce. I mean, there's no question there's an enormous amount of money behind Common Core. But again, I think that some of the big business interests around it, there's no question, I think, are doing it, again, for this sort of workforce development view. I mean, the thing that I'm a little curious about is that there's no question the conflicts of interest around Common Core have conflicts of interest. I mean, you have organizations that may or may not benefit from technology deals that are advocating for these things. And I think the other thing that's, noteworthy about, say, IBM or some of the other, larger corporations is that, they generally speaking don't hire a lot of high school graduates. They actually hire more college graduates, particularly in these, science and technology fields. So I think there is a kind of an agenda there. So.
Okay, I have one more really good question, but just the article by Robert Scott, can we get that on your website?
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's called The Republic of Republics.
Okay, that's not
by
my
Robert
question.
Scott and Chuck Grassley, the senator from
The Republic of Republics?
A Republic of Republics.
Okay.
I can't remember the exact title, but how Common
that's
Core
close enough.
damages
Jan
state
Robbins
local.
is with,
Jane Robbins is
Jane.
with the American Principles Project.
okay,
And if you do a Google search, her name will pop up right away, and there's an excellent YouTube video where she talks about the data collection.
and Joy
again,
Pullman is with Pioneer?
no, she's with the Heartland Institute.
Heartland,
Yeah.
okay.
So those are two authors that we've commissioned to look into the data issue in more
Okay.
detail.
All right, now, a question that I have for you is, we're told all the time, these are just standards.
Yep.
You can do anything you want within the standards. But standards determine what's on the test.
Right.
Which is going to, would you not agree with this
Yeah.
question? That standards determine what's going to be on the assessments, which then will determine what is taught, which then determines your curriculum. So
Right.
do you think the standards
Yeah.
and not curriculum, what is your thoughts on that?
So this is what we know. We know that the federal government has incentivized states to adopt Common Core through Race to the Top, and we know that the federal government has directly funded the 2 national testing consortia. They claim that they're not in curriculum, but the title of the legal paper, again, written by these 2 lead lawyers from the second Bush administration, is called A Road to a National Curriculum. The standards are kind of a scaffolding, and then the local curriculum fits in at the state and local level with that. But if you determine the standards and you've basically boxed in so that the curriculum will have to be a Common Core curriculum. And in point of fact, the application for the 2 national testing consortia, PARC and the Smarter Balance, the U.S. Department of Education specifically mentions that they are also supposed to develop curricular and instructional materials to go along with the testing. Mm-hmm. So this idea that it isn't a curriculum or it won't be a curriculum, it's a real fig leaf. I think only common sense tells you that that's where that's heading.
Mm-hmm. Last question, it's real short. He can answer this
Okay.
in one sentence. Okay, Utah is one of the states that's gotten out of PARC, and they've gotten into something else, AIM or something. Do you know about that?
Yeah. So there.
What is it?
So you folks got out of PARC. Utah got out of Smarter Balance.
Smarter Balance. Okay.
Georgia got out of PARC, and just yesterday, the governor of Florida pulled them out of PARC. So there is a minimum. When the U.S. Department of Education funded the 2 national testing consortia, there's a minimum, I think, of 15 states, and PARC is, I think, at 16, or it's close now. But the U.S. Department of Education said they're going to brush that aside. So I think at this point, the testing consortia will go forward. But, you know, the testing side is still kind of an open question because, look, the states adopted both the standards and committed to the tests before they were done. And the tests, I mean, we know from research that we've done and conversations we've had that they've used a cost of like $29 for PARC. There's a 40-year testing expert who I met with from California who told me that's a budget appropriation figure. It's actually going to be like $39 per student for both of the testing consortia. But they're also running about a year behind. So by Oklahoma pulling out of PARC, you've not only given yourself a little bit of breathing room to pursue some other options, but, you know, what I would do is I would try to, you could work with Texas. I mean, we all should sort of say a prayer for Texas every night because from the beginning they said they weren't doing this, and it's a huge textbook state and it's a huge driver of things in K-12 education. And so there will be materials, there will be tests, there will be textbooks that will be non-Common Core, and it's because of Texas. I don't know if I answered your question, but.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gass. We appreciate it so much. We want to thank all 3 of our presenters. I want to thank all of the legislators who are here and all of you who are here. Thank you so much for being here. We are adjourned.